The Prince from Niccolo Machiavelli is essentially a pragmatic philosophy applied to people who seek to advance themselves or an idea or a party or whatever it may be they seek to advance. Machiavelli lays down the methods he saw working in his time and throughout history and created a philosophy that he felt rulers and leaders could use to A, obtain power, and B, to maintain power. You've had people, criminals, small-time criminals like Whitey Bulger being influenced by the prince while in prison, then using methods to become a kingpin. You have small-time dope fiends like a one Nicky Barnes who goes into prison, a junkie, reads Machiavelli's, influenced by Machiavelli.
He had a book he was reading one day, and I asked him what the book was, and he showed me the book. It was The Prince by Machiavelli.
Leaves prison and becomes the biggest drug kingpin in New York City in his time. We have politicians to this day reading it, and although it is a bit dated, many of its lessons could still be applied to yourself this very day, whether you're seeking advancement in yourself, in an idea, in an occupation, whatever it may be. So with all that said, let's dive into Niccolo Machiavelli's work, The Prince. First, Machiavelli speaks about there are two kinds of principalities, and the principalities today would be our politicians. There's the hereditary one, or we can say the incumbent one in our lifetime, and there's the new one. So you either have what exists or what is coming to replace what exists. So let's start. He starts on the concerning of hereditary principalities. I say at once there are fewer difficulties in holding hereditary states, and those long accustomed to the family of their prince, than new ones. For it is sufficient only not to transgress the customs of his ancestors, and to deal prudently with circumstances as they arise, for a prince of average powers to maintain himself in his state. And if he should be so deprived of it, whenever anything sinister happens to the usurper, he will regain it. For the hereditary prince has less cause and less necessity to offend. Hence it happens that he will be more loved, and unless extraordinary vices causes him to be hated, it is reasonable to expect that his subjects will be naturally well disposed towards him. And in the antiquity and duration of his rule, the memories and the motives that make for change are lost. For one change always leaves the toothing for another. And you've seen that play out in many different revolutions. In fact, in a lot of the videos of the people I went down, you saw that as soon as one party comes up, gets changed, then someone else either assassinates the leader or puts another party in there, or there's a coup going on. But essentially, Machiavelli is saying the hereditary prince, the politician that's the incumbent, usually has a better chance to win because people already know what to expect, and it's harder for him to offend. But when it gets to a point, which is where I think we're at today, when the vices have become so bad, and in our day when our politicians have just become so corrupt, there becomes a desire for something new and a change. And I think we've seen that play out in the American political process for the past couple years now. On both red team and blue team, they're starting to elect and support people that are not incumbents, that are not, official politicians or Ivy League lawyer politicians. Let's go on to concerning mixed principalities. But the difficulties occur in a new principality. And firstly, if it be not entirely new, but is as it were a member of a state which, taken collectively, may be called composite, the changes arise chiefly from an inherent difficulty which there is in all new principalities. For men change their rulers willingly, hoping to better themselves, and this hope induces them to take up arms against him who rules, wherein they are deceived because they afterward find by experience they have gone from bad to worse. In this way you have enemies in all those whom you have injured in seizing that principality, and you are not able to keep those friends who put you there because of your not being able to satisfy them in the way they expected, and you cannot take strong measures against them, feeling bound to them. He who has annexed them, if he wishes to hold them, has only to bear in mind two considerations. The one, that the family of their former lord is extinguished. The other, that neither their laws nor their taxes are altered, so that in a very short time they will become entirely one body with the old principality. So he's saying the new person, you have to kill the old leader because you don't want their name being whispered amongst the people when things are going bad. And if their laws and taxes are not so oppressive and are either accepted and tolerated by the people, there's no reason to really go in there and change it. And I've seen this in the business world a lot, where a new boss would come in and they would change everything. And even some of the things that worked before he came there, they would change just simply to put their own stamp on it. And a lot of times that would bring about resentment amongst the workers, especially if you had a system that was pretty decent and working. So that is something, new people coming into management positions in businesses could learn. You don't need to change things if they're working. We go on. But when states are acquired in a country differing in language, custom, or laws, there are difficulties, and good fortune and great energy are needed to hold them. That's basically America. And one of the greatest and most real helps would be that he who has acquired them should go and reside there. This would make his position more secure and durable, as if it has made that of the Turk in Greece, who, notwithstanding all other measures taken by him for holding that state, if he had not settled there, would not have been able to keep it. Because if one is on the spot, disorders are seen as they spring up, and one can quickly remedy them. But if one is not at hand, they are heard of only when they are great, and then one can no longer remedy them. So, it should be kind of common sense in applying it to today. Like if you worked for a certain district, you should live amongst that district, or at least always be there so you know what's going on. One has to remark that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries. Of more serious ones, they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be such kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. Either the person is treated well, or if they're not treated well, you have to treat them very bad. As Machiavelli says, crush them. In a more modern context with an organization or a business, it's either you fire them or you treat them well. It's like you can't have disgruntled employees around you. The prince who holds a country differing in the above respects ought to make himself the head and defender of its less powerful neighbors, and to weaken the more powerful amongst them, taking care that no foreigner as powerful as himself shall by any accident get a footing there. For it will always happen that such a one will be introduced by those who are discontented, either through excess of ambition or through fear. And the usual course of affairs is that as soon as a powerful foreigner enters a country, all the subject states are drawn to him, moved by the hatred which they feel against the ruling power. So essentially keeping a strong structure around you, even with neighboring states. So for example, like in the example of America today, we would have Mexico and Canada on our borders. It would be good to have very good relations with them, and even willing to protect them when necessary, in order to stop like another power, let's say like China, from getting a bunch of influence and then them popping up military bases right on our borders. All right, we go on. Why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death. I answer that the principalities of which one has record are found to be governed in two different ways, either by a prince, with a body of servants who assist him to govern the kingdom, as ministers by his favor and permission, or by a prince and barons, who hold that dignity by antiquity of blood, and not by the grace of the prince. Such barons have states and their own subjects, who recognize them as lords and hold them in natural affection. I guess our blood elite of today could be our corporate elite of today. Those states that are governed by a prince and his servants hold their prince in more consideration, because in all the country there is no one who is recognized as superior to him. And if they yield obedience to another, they do it as to a minister and an official, and they do not bear any particular affection. Therefore, he who considers both of these states will recognize great difficulties in seizing the state of the Turk, but once it is conquered, great ease in holding it. But if once the Turk has been conquered and routed in the field in such a way that he cannot replace his armies, there is nothing to fear but the family of this prince, and this being exterminated, there remains no one to fear. the other having no credit with the people, and the conqueror did not rely on them before his victory, so he ought not fear about it. Such men, for the given reasons, can open the way into the state and render the victory easy. But if you wish to hold it afterwards, you meet with infinite difficulties, both from those who have assisted you and from those you have crushed. Nor is it enough for you to have exterminated the family of the prince, because the lords that remain make themselves the heads of fresh movements against you. And as you are unable either to satisfy or exterminate them, the state is lost whenever time brings the opportunity. Now, if you will consider what was the nature of the government of Darius, you will find it similar to that to the kingdom of the Turk. And therefore it was only necessary for Alexander first to overthrow him in the field, and then to take the country from him, after which the victory, Darius being killed, the state remained secure to Alexander for the above reasons.
So he's referencing the Ottomans, just like Darius in his time. Unlike many places in Europe, were set up, the kings, sultans, leaders, whatever, ran their government through a system of appointed people, as opposed to a system of barons, dukes, etc. People who are not appointed, but came into influence because of their family line.
So that was the first part, basically dealing with what kind of principalities there are or were, and how they go about either maintaining or gaining power. Now let's go into how you're governing a city once you have the power. Concerning the way to govern cities or principalities which lived under their own laws before they were annexed. Whenever those states which have been acquired, as stated, have been accustomed to live under their own laws and in freedom, there are three courses for those who wish to hold them. The first is to ruin them. The next is to reside there in person. The third is to permit them to live under their own laws, drawing a tribute and establishing within an oligarchy which will keep it friendly to you. Because such a government, being created by the prince, knows that it cannot stand without his friendship and interest, and does its utmost to support him. And therefore he who would keep a city accustomed to freedom will hold it more easily by the means of its own citizens than in any other way. And he who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it, for in rebellion it has always the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privileges unless they are disunited or dispersed, but at every chance they immediately rally to them, as Pisa after 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. But in republics there is more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance, which will never permit them to allow the memory of their former liberty to rest, so that the safest way is to destroy them or to reside there. So once again he uses the measuring stick of, if you're going to offend against something, then you better crush it. Better not half-ass it, you better just crush it, if you're going to take that path. Okay, now concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arm and ability. Let no one be surprised if, in speaking of an entirely new principalities, as I shall do, I adduce the highest examples both of prince and of state, because men, walking almost always in paths beaten by others, and following by imitation their deeds, are yet unable to keep entirely to the ways of others, or to attain to the power of those they imitate. A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will savor of it. Which I believe is why it's important to know of great men, or to have men you admire, know their life story, know what they had to do to overcome whatever obstacles in their way, learn from things like that, apply that to your own life as much as possible. Let him act like the clever archers who, designing to hit the mark which yet appears too far distant, and knowing the limits to which the strength of their bow attains, take aim much higher than the mark, not to reach by their strength or arrow to so great a height, but to be able, with the aid of so high an aim, to hit the mark they wish to reach. But to come to those who, by their own ability, and not through fortune, have risen to be princes, I say that Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and the such like are the most excellent examples. Without that opportunity, their powers of mind would have been extinguished, and without those powers, the opportunity would have come in vain. It was necessary that Cyrus should find the Persians discontented with the government of the Medes, and the Medes soft and effeminate through their long peace. Theseus could not have shown his ability had he not found Athens dispersed. These opportunities therefore made those men fortunate, and their high ability enabled them to recognize opportunity whereby their country was ennobled and made famous. So right times call for the right people, these men of action and ability, taking advantage of the situation. And once again, I think we're in that epoch today, where we are in a landscape, where we are, yes, soft and effeminate, where we are discontented, where people are frustrated with the quote-unquote hereditary principality, the current incumbent system, the team red versus team blue dialect of our politics. And one of the things truly missing are these hero figures. It is, unfortunately, seemingly a vital component. Those who by valorous ways became princes like these men acquire a principality with difficulty, but keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it rise in part from the new rules and methods which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. The coolness arises partly from the fear of the opponents who have not the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. Thus it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it like partisans, while the others defend lukewarmly, in such wise that the prince is endangered along with them. And that is so true. I mean, that is so true to this day, as far as because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions. So you can look at all the boomers in their house. I mean, if you look at the counter system movements on the quote unquote right and the quote unquote left right now, you have this exactly playing out. You have people who are, not completely happy with the system, but are willing to keep it going because they're comfortable, they have wealth, they've made a good living for themselves. And then even the people that are dissidents on the left and the right, they're lukewarm defenders. I mean, look how much people are really willing to sacrifice for their causes. The left, they'll go as far as to, throw rocks through glass or to have a protest and put masks on. The right will do, kind of the same, have their little group meetings or trolling online. And a lot of people don't want to get doxxed and get in trouble and go to jail. It's like they're not really, they're lukewarm defenders of their idea, essentially. And on both sides, it is very... It's very comfort and bougie mentality in their resistance. They are the lukewarm defenders of something new to the system. And then, yes, you're going to have to go against all the people who are upper middle class, the petty bourgeois, they're called, who have done well. And like I said, they don't want something new because it's like, well, I put my time in. I have my house. I have my cars. I'm getting to later stages of my life. I want to enjoy more, relax more. So that's the boomer mentality there. It is necessary, therefore, if we desire to discuss this matter thoroughly, to inquire whether these innovators can rely on themselves or have to depend on others. That is to say, whether to consummate their enterprise, have they to use prayers or can they use force? In the first instance, they always succeed badly and never compass anything. But when they can rely on themselves and use force, then they are rarely endangered. Hence, and here's one of my favorite lines from the whole book, hence it is that all armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. Might makes right. If Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long. Therefore, such as these have great difficulties in consummating their enterprise, for all their dangers are in the ascent, yet with ability they will overcome them. But when these are overcome and those who envied them their success are exterminated, they will begin to be respected, and they will continue afterwards powerful, secure, honored, and happy. Concerning new principalities which are acquired either by the arms of others or by good fortune. Those who solely by good fortune become princes from private citizens have little trouble in rising, but much in keeping atop. They have not any difficulties on the way up because they fly, but they have many when they reach the summit. Such stand simply elevated upon the goodwill and the fortune of him who has elevated them, two most inconsistent and unstable things. Neither have they the knowledge requisite for the position, because unless they are men of great worth and ability, it is not reasonable to expect that they should know how to command, having always lived in a private condition. Besides, they cannot hold it because they have not the forces which they can keep friendly and faithful. He uses an example of Cesare Borgia, and a lot of the prince is said to be molded after his experience with Cesare Borgia. He says, on the other hand, Cesare Borgia, called by the people Duke Valentino, acquired his state during the ascendancy of his father. His father was Pope Alexander, and on its decline he lost it. Notwithstanding that he had taken every measure and done all that ought to be done by a wise and able man to fix firmly his roots in the states which the arms and fortunes of others had bestowed on him. Because, as is stated above, he who has not first laid his foundations may be able with great ability to lay them afterwards, but they will be laid with trouble to the architect and danger to the building. So the Duke, therefore, having acquired Romania and beaten the Colonnesi, while wishing to hold that and to advance further, was hindered by two things. The one, his forces did not appear loyal to him. The other, the goodwill of France. That is to say, he feared that the forces of the Orsini, which he was using, would not stand to him, that not only might they hinder him from winning more, but might themselves seize what he had won, and that the king might also do the same. Hence the Duke decided to depend no more upon the arms and the luck of others. For the first thing, he weakened the Orsini and the Colonnesi parties in Rome by gaining to himself all their adherents who were gentlemen, making them his gentlemen, giving them good pay and according to their rank honoring them with office and command in such a way that in a few months all attachment to the factions was destroyed and turned entirely to the Duke. From this sprung the rebellion at the Urbino and the tumults in the Romagna, with endless dangers to the Duke, all of which he overcame with the help of the French. Having restored his authority, not to leave it at risk by trusting either to the French or to other outside forces, he had recourse to his wiles, and he knew so well how to console his mind that, by the mediation of Signor Pagolo, whom the Duke did not fail to secure with all kinds of attention, giving him money, apparel, and horses, the Orsini were reconciled, so that their simplicity brought them into his power at Sinigaglia, having exterminated the leaders and turned their partisans into his friends. The Duke laid sufficiently good foundations to his power, having all of the Romagna and the Duchy of Urbino, and the people now beginning to appreciate their prosperity, he gained them all over to himself. And as this point is worthy of notice, and to be imitated by others, I am not willing to leave it out. When the Duke occupied the Romagna, he found it under the rule of weak masters, who rather plundered their subjects than ruled them, and gave them more cause for disunion than for union, so that the country was full of robbery, quarrels, and every kind of violence. And so, wishing to bring back peace and obedience to authority, he considered it necessary to give it a good governor. Thereupon he promoted Messer Romero di Orco, a swift and cruel man, to whom he gave fullest power. This man in a short time restored peace and unity with great success. Afterwards, the Duke considered that it was not only advisable to confer such excessive authority, for he had no doubt but that he would become odious, so he set up a court of judgment in the country under a most excellent president, wherein all cities had their advocates. and because he knew that the past severity had caused some hatred against himself, so to clear himself in the minds of the people and gain them entirely to himself, he desired to show that, if any cruelty had been practiced, it had not originated with him, but in the natural sternness of the minister. Under this pretense, he took Ramiro, and one morning caused him to be executed and left on the piazza at Siena, with the block and a bloody knife at his side. The barbarity of this spectacle caused the people to be at once satisfied and dismayed.
So he puts a hardline person in charge of a newly conquered city, and this person, using his hardline tactics, gets the city in order, but of course there's lots of resentment. So then he puts on a public trial, probably a mock trial, and then has him executed in a very gruesome and public way to show to people, and he comes in as the hero for that. So he essentially saves the people from a tyrant and becomes beloved by them, even though he's their new conqueror. So it is pretty ingenious in that sense, and you could see why Machiavelli based so much of The Prince off of the moves of Cesare Borgia during his period of questing for a unified Italy.
But Alexander died, Pope Alexander, Cesare's father. But Alexander died 5 years after he had first drawn the sword. He left the Duke with the state of Romagna alone, consolidated, with the rest in the air between the two most powerful hostile armies, and sick unto death. Cesare got very sick. Like at the worst time all this shit goes down. His father dies. He had, like I said, the Cesare Borgia story is very, very interesting. He had conquered many of the city-states that existed at the time in Italy, and he had the idea of uniting all of Italy, and of course him being the king. Cesare had that vision. He was always chasing Caesar in his life. One of his mottos, even I believe engraved on one of his swords, was either Caesar or nothing. So he set his goals high. And as he's getting closer to that goal, his father dies. He gets sick, real sick, to where he's bedridden and on the edge of death. So all these things happening at the worst time, where people are plotting against him, why his father's enemy becomes the new pope, Julius II. Okay, we go on though. Yet there were in the Duke such boldness and ability, and he knew so well how men are to be won or lost, and so firm were their foundations, which in so short a time he had laid, that if he had not those armies on his back, or if he had been in good health, he would have overcome all difficulties. So Machiavelli is a fan of Cesare. Once again, the Prince probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Machiavelli being able to be at Cesare's side enough, and even to be on his enemy's side, and to see it from all perspectives. On the day that Julius II was elected, he told me that he had thought of everything that might occur at the death of his father, and had provided a remedy for all, except that he had never anticipated that when the death did happen, he himself would be on that point to die. When all the actions of the Duke are recalled, I do not know how to blame him, but rather it appears to be, as I said, that I ought to offer him for imitation to all those, by the fortune or their arms of others, are raised to government. Because he, having a lofty spirit and far-reaching aims, could not have regulated his conduct otherwise, and only the shortness of the life of Alexander and his own sickness frustrated his designs. On Cesare Borgia's epitaph, it says, "Here lies in a little earth he who everyone feared, he who peace and war held in his hand. O you who go in search of worthy things to praise, if you would praise the worthiest, then your path stops here, and you do not need to go any farther." I'm not sure who wrote that, but it's definitely high praise of the guy, to die so young too. Therefore, he who considers it necessary to secure himself in his new principality, to win friends, to overcome either by force or fraud, to make himself beloved and feared by the people, to be followed and revered by the soldiers, to exterminate those who have power or the reason to hurt him, to change the old order of things for new, to be severe and gracious, magnanimous and liberal, to destroy a disloyal soldiery and create a new, to maintain friendship with kings and princes in such a way they must help him with zeal and offend with caution, cannot find a more lively example than the actions of this man. Only can he be blamed for the election of Julius II, in whom he made a bad choice, because, as is said, not being able to elect a pope to his own mind, he could have hindered any other from being elected pope, and he ought never to have consented to the election of any cardinal whom he had injured or who had caused to fear him if they became pontiffs. For men injure either from fear or hatred. He who believes that the new benefits will cause great personages to forget the old injuries is deceived. Therefore the Duke erred in his choice, and it was the cause of his ultimate ruin. So essentially he couldn't get the Pope he wanted, but he could have gone out of his way to stop Julius II, who was his father's enemy, who hated the Borgias. But Cesare, either through ignorance or arrogance, thought it wouldn't be largely a problem dealing with Julius II, and therefore did not go out of his way to stop him, which he probably could have done, from becoming the Pope. Even if not getting the one he desired, would have got a different one than Julius II, which would have definitely been better for him. Now we go on. Concerning those who have obtained a principality by wickedness. It is to be remarked that in seizing a state, the usurper ought to examine closely into all those injuries which it is necessary for him to inflict, and to do them all at one stroke, so not as to have to repeat them daily. And thus by not unsettling men he will be able to reassure them and win them to himself by benefits. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep the knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing to their continued and repeated wrongs, for injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that, being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. So if you're rising by wickedness or just killing the enemies, it should be done in one stroke instead of having people, your subjects, under fear, could they be next, which could entice them to rebel against you, or could entice them to be more disloyal, or to keep plotting against you, figuring that their time's going to come no matter what anyways. And they in turn appreciate the benefits that they are given concerning a civil principality, where a leading citizen becomes a prince of his country, not by wickedness or intolerable violence, but by the favor of his fellow citizens. This may be called a civil principality. Nor is genius or fortune altogether necessary to attain it, but rather a happy shrewdness. I say that such a principality is obtained either by the favor of the people or by the favor of the nobles. I guess you could say we're in a civil principality now, because you're elected by the people, and if you're in favor of the nobles, international finance today, so pander to the people and serve the elite. Because in all cities, these two distinct parties are found. And from this it arises that the people do not wish to be ruled nor oppressed by the nobles, and the nobles wish to rule and oppress the people. And from these two opposite desires there arises in cities one of three results, either a principality, self-government, or anarchy. A principality is created either by the people or the nobles accordingly, as one or the other of them has the opportunity. For the nobles, seeing they cannot withstand the people, begin to cry up the reputation of one of themselves. They make him a prince, so that under his shadow they can give vent to their ambitions. The people, finding they cannot resist the nobles, also cry up to the reputation of one of themselves, and make him a prince, so as to be defended by his authority. He who obtains sovereignty by the assistance of the nobles maintains himself with more difficulty than he who comes to it by the aid of the people, because the former finds himself with many around him who consider themselves his equal, and because of this he can neither rule nor manage them to his liking. But he who reaches sovereignty by popular favor finds himself alone and has none around him, or few who are not prepared to obey him. Besides this, one cannot by fair dealing and without injury to others satisfy the nobles. but you can satisfy the people, for their object is more righteous than that of the nobles, the latter wishing to oppress, while the former only desire not to be oppressed. I say that the nobles ought to be looked at mainly in two ways. That is to say, that either shape their course in such a way as binds them entirely to your fortune, or they do not. Those who do not bind themselves may be dealt with in two ways. They may fail to do this through pusillanimity and natural want of courage, in which case you ought to make use of them, especially of those who are of good counsel, and thus, while in prosperity you honor them, in adversity you do not have to fear them. But when for their own ambitious ends they shun binding themselves, it is a token that they are given more thought to themselves than to you. A prince ought to guard against such, and to fear them as if they were open enemies, because in adversity they always help to ruin him. Therefore, one who becomes a prince through the favor of the people ought to keep them friendly, and this he can easily do, seeing they only do not ask to be oppressed by him. And do not let anyone impugn this statement with the trite proverb that he who builds on the people builds on mud. For this is true when a private citizen makes a foundation there, and persuades himself that the people will free him when he is oppressed by his enemies or his magistrates, wherein he would find himself very often deceived. But granted, a prince who has established himself as above, who can command and is a man of courage, undismayed in adversity, who does not fail in other qualifications, and who is by his own resolution and energy keeps the whole people in courage, such a one will never find himself deceived in them, and it will be shown that he has laid his foundations well. So, into the saying, he who builds on people builds on mud, I mean, that's pretty funny, but Machiavelli's saying that if that's the case, it's because of your bad leadership. You're the one that laid the weak foundations. In the latter case, their government is weaker and more insecure because it rests entirely on the goodwill of those citizens who are raised to the magistracy, and who, especially in troubled times, can destroy the government with great ease, either by intrigue or open defiance. The prince has not the chance amid tumults to exercise absolute authority because the citizens and subjects, accustomed to receive orders from the magistrates, are not of a mind to obey him amid these confusions, and there will always be in doubtful times a scarcity of men whom he can trust. Therefore, a wise prince ought to adopt such a course that his citizens will always, in every sort and kind of circumstance, have need of the state and of him, and then he will always find them faithful. That which concerns a prince on the subject of the art of war. A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline, for this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules. And it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from a private station to that rank. So the first and most important part of obtaining power or holding power is war. Once again, might makes right, because there is nothing proportionate between the armed and the unarmed. And it is not reasonable that he who is armed should yield obedience willing to him who is unarmed, or that the unarmed man should be secure among armed servants. He ought never, therefore, to have out of his thought this subject of war, and in peace he should addict himself more to its exercise than in war. This he can do in two ways, one by action, the other by study. As regards the action, he ought above all things to keep his men well organized and drilled, to follow incessantly the chase, by which he accustom his body to hardships, and learns something of the nature of localities, and gets to find how the mountains rise and how the valleys open out, how the plains lie, to understand the nature of the rivers, the marshes, and in all this to take the greatest care. But to exercise the intellect, the prince should read histories and study their actions of illustrious men, to see how they have been born themselves in war, to examine the causes of their victories and defeat, so as to avoid the latter and imitate the former. And above all, do as an illustrious man did, who took as an exemplar one who had been praised and famous before him, and whose achievements and deeds he always kept in his mind. As it is said, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar, Alexander, Scipio, Cyrus, and whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will recognize afterwards in the life of Scipio how that imitation was his glory, and how in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality Scipio conformed to those things which have been written of Cyrus by Xenophon. A wise prince ought to observe such rules and never in peaceful times stand idle, but increase his resources with industry in such a way that they may be available to him in adversity. So if fortune chances, it may find him prepared to resist her blows. Concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, i.e. libertarians, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. And I know that everyone will confess that it would be most praiseworthy in a prince to exhibit all the above qualities that are considered good. But because they can neither be entirely possessed nor observed, for human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be sufficiently prudent that he may know how to avoid the reproach of those vices which would lose him his state, and also to keep himself, if it be possible, from those which would not lose him it. But this not being possible, he may with less hesitation abandon himself to them. And again, he need not make himself uneasy at incurring a reproach, for those vices without which the state can only be saved with difficulty, for if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which looks like virtue, if followed, would be his ruin, while something else, which looks like vice, yet followed, brings him security and prosperity. So there are aspects of your goodness or your moral compass that can be used against you. And there can be times when things you think are bad, be it force or anything else, can be something positive for you. But if you're completely dogmatic in the way you lead, you govern, or whatever, even how you conduct your own self, your weaknesses and the point of attack are a lot more obvious to your enemies because you are very predictable in your actions and your response. Concerning liberality and meanness, I say that it would be well to be reputed liberal. Nevertheless, liberality exercised in a way that does not bring you the reputation for it injures you. For if one exercises it honestly and as it should be exercised, it may not become known, and you will not avoid the reproach of its opposite. Therefore, anyone wishing to maintain among men the name of liberal is obliged to avoid no attribute of magnificence, so that a prince thus inclined will consume in such acts all his property, and will be compelled, in the end, if he wish to maintain the name of liberal, to unduly weigh down his people and tax them and do everything he can to get money. If he is wise, he ought not fear the reputation of being mean, for in time he will come to be more considered than if liberal, seeing that with his economy his revenues are enough, that he can defend himself against all attacks and is able to engage in enterprises without burdening his people. Thus it comes to pass that he exercises liberality towards all from whom he does not take, who are numberless, and meanness towards those to whom he does not give, who are few. We have not seen great things done in our time except by those who have been considered mean. The rest have failed. And if anyone should say Caesar obtained empire by liberality, and many others have reached the highest positions having been liberal, and by being considered so, I answer, either you are a prince in fact, or in a way to become one. In the first case, this liberality is dangerous. In the second, it is very necessary to be considered liberal. And Caesar was one of those who wished to become preeminent in Rome. But if he had survived after becoming so, and had not moderated his expenses, he would have destroyed his government. And if anyone should reply, many have been princes and have done great things with armies who have been considered very liberal, I reply, either a prince spends that which is his own or his subjects, or else that of others. In the first case, he ought to be sparing. In the second, he ought not to neglect any opportunity for liberality. And to the prince who goes forth with his army, supporting it by pillage, sack, and extortion, handling that which belongs to others, this liberality is necessary. Otherwise, he would not be followed by soldiers. And of that which is neither yours nor your subjects, you can be a ready giver, as were Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander, because it does not take away your reputation if you squander that of others, but it adds to it. It is only squandering your own that injures you. And your own meaning either if you're in a position, like he's talking about a lot of these people, rulers of the past having their own wealth, or either through taxation. That can be considered your own. You should be a little more sparing with that and not so liberal with the money. But once again, if it's through pillage, then yeah, it makes a lot more sense to be a lot more liberal with the givings to the soldiers. And a prince should guard himself above all things against being despised and hated. And liberality leads you to both. Therefore, it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness, which brings reproach, without hatred, than be compelled through seeking a reputation for liberality to incur a name for rapacity, which begets reproach with hatred. Concerning cruelty and clemency, and whether it be better to be loved than feared. Therefore a prince, so as long as he keeps his subject united and loyal, ought not mind the reproach of cruelty, because with a few examples he will be more merciful than those who, through too much mercy, allow disorder to arise, from which follow murders or robberies, for these are wont to injure the whole people, while those executions which originate with a prince offend the individual only. Upon this a question arises, whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be an answer that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two either must be dispensed with. Because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous. As long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, as it is said above, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. And men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment, which never fails. Yeah, and of course, do you not break a law and go kill someone you don't like because you love your fellow human, or because you're going to get punished and thrown in prison for doing it? I think it's pretty obvious. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared while he is not hated, which will always be as long as he abstains from the property of his citizens and subjects, and from their women. So don't take their houses, their lands, or their women, and you shouldn't get too much hate from the people. But when it is necessary for him to proceed against the life of someone, he must do it on proper justification, and for a manifest cause. But above all things he must keep his hands off the property of others, because men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. Among the wonderful deeds of Hannibal, this one is enumerated, that having led an enormous army composed of many various races of men to fight in foreign lands, no dissensions arose either among them or against the prince, whether in his bad or in his good fortune. This arose from nothing else than his inhumane cruelty, which, with his boundless valor, made him revered and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. But without that cruelty, his other virtues were not sufficient to produce this effect. Returning to the question of being feared or loved, I come to the conclusion that men, loving according to their own will and fearing according to that of the prince, A wise prince should establish himself on that which in his own control and not in that of others he must endeavor only to avoid hatred, as is noted. And think about a stern father figure. And there you go. You don't hate the stern father, but you know there could be repercussions for breaking the rules. And you can think about a drill instructor, professor, anyone of authority position, that you may fear punishment from them, but at the same time you do not hate them. Concerning the way in which princes should keep faith. Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep faith, and to live with integrity and not with craft. Nevertheless, our experience has been of those princes who have done great things, have held good faith of little account, and have known how to circumvent the intellect of men by craft, and in the end have overcome those who have relied on their word. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against the snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against the wolves. Therefore it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves. So cunning and strong, calculating but brave. But it is necessary to know how well to disguise this characteristic, and to be a great pretender and dissembler. And men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. One recent example I cannot pass over in silence. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men, nor ever thought of doing otherwise, and he always found victims. For there never was a man who had a greater power in asserting, or who with greater oaths would affirm a thing, yet would observe it less. Nevertheless, his deceits always succeeded according to his wishes, because he well understood this side of mankind. An old Italian proverb about the Borgias: Alexander never did what he said, Pope Alexander, and Cesare never said what he did. Therefore, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. Therefore, it is necessary for him to have a mind ready to turn itself accordingly as the winds and variations of fortune force it. Yet, as I have said above, not to diverge from the good if he can avoid doing so, but, if compelled, then to know how to set about it. For this reason, a prince ought to take care that he never lets anything slip from his lips that is not replete with the above named 5 qualities, that he may appear to him who sees and hears him altogether merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. There is nothing more necessary to appear to have than this last quality, inasmuch as men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, too few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are, and those few do not dare oppose themselves to the opinion of the many, who have the majesty of the state to defend them. And in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, which it is not prudent to challenge, one judges by the result. All right, that one should avoid being despised and hated. It makes him hated above all things, as I have said, to be rapacious and to be a violator of the property and women of his subjects, from both of which he must abstain. And when neither their property nor their honor is touched, the majority of men live content, and he has only to contend with the ambition of a few, whom he can curb with ease in many ways. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, from all of which a prince should guard himself as from a rock, and he should endeavor to show in his actions greatness, courage, gravity, and fortitude, and in his private dealings with his subjects let him show that his judgments are irrevocable, and maintain himself in such reputation that no one can hope either to deceive him or to get around him. But concerning his subjects, when affairs outside are distributed, he has only to fear that they will conspire secretly, from which a prince can easily secure himself by avoiding being hated and despised, and by keeping the people satisfied with him, which it is most necessary for him to accomplish. And one of the most efficacious remedies that a prince can have against conspiracies is not to be hated and despised by the people. For he who conspires against a prince always expects to please them by his removal. But when the conspirator can only look forward to offending them, he will not have the courage to take such a course. For the difficulties that confront a conspirator are infinite. How flatterers should be avoided, and this is a big one. Because there is no other way of guarding oneself from flatterers except letting men understand that to tell you the truth does not offend you, but when everyone may tell you the truth, respect for you abates. Therefore, a wise prince ought to hold a third course by choosing the wise men in his state, and giving them only the liberty of speaking the truth to him, and then only those things which he inquires, and of none others. But he ought to question them upon everything, and listen to their opinions, and afterwards form his own conclusions. A prince, therefore, ought to take counsel, but only when he wishes, and not when others wish. He ought rather to discourage everyone from offering advice unless he asks for it. But, however, he ought to be a constant inquirer, and afterwards a patient listener concerning the things of which he inquired. Also, on learning that anyone, on any consideration, has not told him the truth, he should let his anger be felt. Because people who are always flattering are either concealing something or after something that they conceal. And lastly, we'll finish with what fortune can affect in human affairs and how to withstand her. Nevertheless, not to extinguish our free will, I hold it to be true that fortune is an arbiter of one half of our actions, but that she still leaves us to direct the other half, or perhaps a little less. I compare her to one of those raging rivers, which when in flood overflows the plains, sweeping away the trees and buildings, bearing away the soil from place to place. Everything flies before it, all yield to its violence, without being able in any way to withstand it. And yet, through its nature by such, it does not follow therefore that men, when the weather becomes fair, shall not make provision both with defenses and barriers, in such a manner that rising again, the water may pass away by canal, and their force be neither so unrestrained nor so dangerous. So it happens with fortune, who shows her power where valor has not prepared to resist her, and thither she turns her forces where she knows that barriers and defenses have not been raised to constrain her. I conclude, therefore, that fortune, being changeful and mankind steadfast in their ways, so long as the two are in agreement, men are successful, but unsuccessful when they fall out. For my part, I consider that it is better to be adventurous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her. And it is seen that she shows herself to be mastered by the adventurous, rather than by those who go to work more coldly. She is therefore always womanlike, a lover of young men, because they are less cautious, more violent, and with more audacity, command her. And that's something the Romans have spoken about for thousands of years, essentially that fortune favors the brave. So that wraps it up for Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Dated in some ways, but I do think the majority of what Machiavelli speaks about can be applied to modern politics, to modern business, and even to your personal self. It is a philosophy of pragmatism. It has been shown that the methods Machiavelli endorses and speaks about have been used to success. It was something that was created through the study of history, of people, and of results. So that was The Prince from Niccolo Machiavelli.